Hi everyone, welcome to week 3 and the final session in the Learning Without Labels Deep Learning workshop. So my name is Shazia Akbar, and so far we've been looking at unsupervised learning in this session. And today is going to be solely focused on weakly supervised learning. Now, there's not a definitive line between unsupervised and weakly supervised learning, so we'll kind of slowly transition into it. But there's some really interesting techniques, some ways you can model your problems, which is what I'm going to talk about today. So just a quick outline. First of all, we're going to talk about self-training. It was one of the topics that actually came up during the Lunch and Learn. And it's a really interesting way of learning a model without any labels whatsoever, but it's still learning in a supervised manner. And then we'll go into multiple instance learning, which is a speciality of mine. It's something that I find quite interesting and very applicable to medical imaging and medical data. And then finally, we'll look at pseudo-labeling techniques. And then right at the end, I just want to mention some other techniques that are used in weakly supervised learning, but we won't have time to go into them in great detail today. So in week 1, I showed you this particular slide, and we were discussing when Y is quite difficult to gather and kind of setting up a nice stage for why we would want to use unsupervised and weakly supervised learning. But you'll notice that whilst it's difficult to gather labels in a lot of these scenarios, we can usually sometimes get some sort of knowledge. So for example, in anomaly detection, we can usually label some sort of anomalies that we gather as we go along, but obviously not every possible anomaly that can occur. And similarly in the biology field, the knowledge is very expensive and subjective, but sometimes we can get some sort of knowledge from the experts, and that can help us build our models. So for example, if I was looking at breast tissue and I was trying to predict something new in the biology, so I wanted to pick up features which are predictive of recurrence in breast cancer, that's very difficult for a medical expert to do because there's no clinical knowledge out there in order to predict recurrence. But I could get information like, what does a cancer cell look like? What does a lymphocyte cell look like? And so on and so forth. So some of that knowledge is usually very easy to gather just from a few labels, so we don't need a lot of them. Now, again, in week 1, I showed you one particular example of a weakly supervised learning framework. But in actual fact, there's lots of ways we can model a weakly supervised learning framework. So this one here is showing you some Noisey labels. So in week 1, I kind of grouped these all together in one bag and called that bag a cat. But that bag may contain some incorrect instances within it. And similarly in other classes here. So if I labeled this entire bag as a dog, we have one instance here which isn't, which doesn't fit. Sorry, this label is incorrect. But you get the idea. We have some Noisey labels as well. We can have a mixture of labeled and unlabeled data, and I think that happens quite more often so than the Noisey labeled approach, where you have some instances and there's some features and properties you can learn from the labeled data set and just transfer them across to the unlabeled data set. And this is an example that I came across in the medical field. So this is an illustration of coarsely labeled data. So here we were trying to estimate tumor cellularity, which is basically the proportion of tumor cells within a certain area. So here we were asking the pathologists to annotate each patch and tell us the proportion of tumor within each patch. So obviously, ideally, we would like it to be very precise and, tell us if there's 21 or 22% within this patch here. But, we're humans, we have some limitations. So they kind of coarsely labeled them into the nearest 5% percentile bin. So this was roughly 25% tumor. And this happens a lot in medical imaging as well, where, you're roughly estimating because there's no way of actually going in and counting or defining exactly what we mean by proportion of tumor cells, especially when you have not just the cells, but surrounding area, and whether do you include them or do you not, and that's very subjective as well. And then finally, we have unstructured data, and this seems to pop up in robotics quite a lot, and also semantic segmentation. So here we might have multiple labels that we've all attached to a single image. So all of these items are within this image, but we may not tell you exactly where these items are because it's very challenging to actually draw around the car, which is actually behind a street lamp. So in itself, because of occlusions and because it's a 3D scene we're looking at, it's very, very hard to label. And similarly here, we've got different numbers of labels than we do here, but some of them are shared and some of them are not. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how you can restructure a lot of the problems that you've maybe been faced with in your work or in your research, and kind of reformulate them and gather some sort of information. But obviously it comes at a price. You know, you don't get super good accuracy as you do with supervised learning. So today I'm going to I've arranged this presentation so that we go from unsupervised kind of up and slowly kind of gradually add labels as we go along these different techniques. So generative modeling is what we talked about in week 1. So I'm not going to repeat myself with generative modeling, but just remember that we're modeling data such that we come up with a distribution that reflects the original data, but it's less noisy and really captures the most important features of the data set, or the training set rather, that we were looking at. So that's one way of modeling our data without the need for any labels whatsoever. So if we move on to self-training, this is a really interesting kind of field of different techniques whereby we're learning a model using the data itself, but we're kind of formulating it in that we give the data and then transform it in some way and apply that as our labels. So it's using a supervised learning framework, but by transforming data and forcing it to learn another form of the same data, we're actually learning something very useful within the data itself. So the benefits of that is that the ground truth is available for free. We don't need anyone to go in and label anything at all. And there's also a lot of different approaches that we can take. So I've given you some examples here, but we're going to go into a little bit more detail about some of them. So colorization is something that you've probably seen in the media quite a lot as well. It kind of goes hand in hand with inpainting as well. And the idea here is that you give, even though you have colored images, you would just give the model the grayscale component of that image. And then the task is for that model to predict the colors of that grayscale image. So in colorization, we actually define the color space not in RGB, but in the LEV color space. It just works a lot better, and it approximates the human vision as well. So it kind of reflects the way we interpret our world as well. Again, using our human components to build deep learning frameworks, which is really interesting. So we treat this as a classification problem. So we give the L color space, the grayscale component, and the job of the model is to predict the A and the B components. And it's defined as a classification task where the job of the model is to classify each individual pixel for the A and B color space. So I'm going to show you the model here. So you can see that there's a series of convolutional layers from the L component, the likeness component. You'll also notice that there's no pooling layers here. The only way the upscale and downscale images is by using batch norms and just the upsample and downsample layers that you have in PyTorch as well. What's really interesting about this framework, and I found quite fascinating, was that within the loss function, they actually quantize the color space of the A and B channels. So you have a series of bins, and the job of the loss function is also to weight these different bins as well, so that the colors that are used most commonly have a lower weight than those, the colors that are used less commonly have a higher weight than those less commonly used. And that way you're not missing out on any particular color component. And in images, say for example, if we were looking at an airport and an airport strip, and you had just a signpost there that was no entry and therefore was red. It's unfamiliar to see red on an airstrip. Usually it's grays and blue skies or greens and the colors of the planes. So that red component is not seen very often, but you still want to model it within this particular architecture such that you'd be able to adapt and adjust to those such circumstances. What's also really interesting about this architecture is that the authors kind of make it quite clear in the paper that the task here isn't to kind of memorize what image goes with what color. So it's not, the job isn't to memorize that here a butterfly should be orange. You know, in some scenarios that is the case. You know, trees are always green, or typically are green if you're looking at them in the summer components. But they can also be, you know, browns and reds in the autumn, which is a very short component of the entire year, and therefore you may not get many images with, you know, grays and reds in them. You know, the sky typically tends to be blue. Rather, the idea here is to learn what the most likely color is to be. So what's a plausible color for this particular image, rather than what's the exact color for this particular image. So the idea in self-training is really to build a model architecture that can perform and recognize the abstractions within this feature, within all of these convolutional layers. And then realistically, what you can do after is kind of remove this component and use the rest of the architecture for some other task. So for example, if you had a big bucket of unlabeled data and very small bucket of labeled data, you can use your unlabeled data to kind of settle all the weights within a very, very deep architecture, and then just use the few labeled components to update, say, a couple of fully connected layers at the end there if you wanted to solve a particular task. And that's a really nice way of kind of taking advantage of deep networks, which have a lot of weights and therefore need a lot of data in order to optimize all of those weights, and also take advantage of smaller data sets which are labeled as well. So this shows that same image that I showed you earlier, but in a little bit more high res. So you can really see how the colors are come into the images, and it performs really, really well if you have sufficient sufficient unlabeled data available. So another technique in self-training is called the Jigsaw task. And the Jigsaw task that you may be aware of already kind of comes after this particular paper here in 2015. So the idea in this particular task was to take one patch from an image, and then take another patch randomly from one of these 8 spaces. And the job of the classifier is then to determine which one of these 8 spaces did that second randomly patch come from. So that's the task here. And it works really well because you're kind of learning, especially within real world kind of data like this, where the spatial and relationship between patches and between, say, the ears and the nose of the cat are very, very important. But actually in 2017, this step was taken a little bit further, where instead of just taking one random patch for each component within an image, they actually took 9 different patches here, randomly shuffled all of them, and then they each went through a model or an architecture. So here I think they use AlexNet just to process each individual patch. And the task here is to determine which order all of those 9 patches should come in. So it's called a context-free network because you're processing each patch independently, and then only in the last layer are you really aggregating all the information on all the abstract features that you've captured. And obviously, you know, there's a lot of permutations, possible permutations. So if you've got 9 tiles, there's a lot of different permutations that can take place, a lot of possible transformations. But here you'll notice that there's only 64 as the output here. And the reason is because they found that all of those permutations made it a very, very difficult problem for the model to solve, and it didn't actually work in practice. So they actually had in the paper a method of creating a subset of permutations using the Hammond distance. And if you're interested, I encourage you to look at it in a little bit more detail. But the idea is that you want to predict the index, which refers to a specific type of permutation for each of these 9 tiles. And you also have probabilistic scores attached to them. So here, the first tile would have a probability attached to what's the chances that it belongs to the 9th the ninth area, which would be the center area here? What are the chances that the second tile here belongs to the fourth positioning in this image here, and so on and so forth. You also notice that the models here also have shared weights, so it's not memory intensive as you think it is. They all have shared weights, so they're basically the same network. They're just all going through independently rather than all together. So in order to avoid some of the in order to avoid the jigsaw technique actually memorizing exactly where particular patches should go and memorizing that the ears, cats are always at the top, because if a cat was lying down, obviously the ears would be somewhere else. So you want to avoid that kind of memorization of positioning. So in order to do that, they kind of had some interesting techniques for introducing random gaps between tiles. They took bigger patches and then took smaller patches from those bigger patches when they were selecting tiles, and also added some random shifts and jitters. So all of this so there's a lot of techniques used to avoid overfitting within the network itself. So this is some of the results. This is a results table that was also taken from the paper, and I find it was really interesting because what they really do in the jigsaw puzzle paper is really force the idea of, here in this network, we're really trying to learn features in every single convolutional layer that you can go away and use for other image detection and image classification tasks. So here, they did a really interesting experiment where they froze like all the layers apart from the convolutional one layer to really test out the features that were learned in each convolutional layer. And they found that on each convolutional layer, it performed fairly well, actually, if we froze just all of the layers except one and then just used it for ImageNet classification here. But also notice that even that two tile approach, where you took one tile and then randomly selected another tile from the surrounding area, that performed fairly well as well. So even just taking two tiles performed significantly well with this particular technique. This may be because that they were using the ImageNet dataset, which is very dependent on positioning and realizing when the sky is above certain objects on the roads and the scenes. So it may be reflective of this particular data set. If you have rotation and variance within your data set, you may choose not to use Jigsaw at all because it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So please use this only when it's appropriate for your data set. Now, and you'll notice a kind of trend that is happening with these self-training techniques. You have your data, you perform some sort of transformation, and then you try and predict that transformation. And that's exactly what they did with the Exemplar networks. It's very similar to Jigsaw in that some transformations do occur, but they're actually a bit more obvious about the transformation. So they scale and they rotate and they add color, they change the color space, they add contrast in the Exemplar network. And the task of the network is to predict actually what type of transformation you've performed on the original data. So here, they called them the seed index. So if you performed 8,000 different perturbations, you have to have an 8,000 kind of length output in order to do the classification task. But again, the purpose here is to use the earlier layers once you've trained this network up, and maybe use it for some other task or problem, or even just use it as a clustering technique, as we did do last week. So that kind of concludes the self-training component. And you can see that's a really interesting way of using data if you have no labels whatsoever. And actually, I would encourage using it if you've been given a data set to play around with. So you've given an initial data set and you've been asked to figure out if there's anything useful that you can do with that data set. Then self-training is a really nice way of just diving in and having a quick look at what's possible, what's achievable, before you go away and collect really expensive labels and from people who just don't have the time available to give those labels. So it's a nice kind of segue from unsupervised learning techniques.